The farmer who learned the real meaning of success in a quiet farming valley surrounded by green hills and endless fields, there lived a man named Thomas. Thomas was known as the hardest worker in the entire valley. Every morning before sunrise, while the world still slept peacefully, Thomas was already awake. At exactly 4 a.m., he stepped into his fields carrying heavy tools on his shoulders. Cold mornings, hot afternoons, long, exhausting evenings. That was his life. His hands were rough and covered with cuts. His back hurt constantly. His clothes were stained with dirt and sweat. But Thomas believed something very deeply. Success belongs to the people who work the hardest. So he worked harder than everyone. He planted crops by hand. He carried water buckets himself. He refused modern machines because he thought struggle made a man stronger. His wife Sarah watched him slowly destroy himself. One evening she quietly asked, "Thomas, when was the last time you rested?" Thomas smiled tiredly. Rest is for people who give up. But secretly, Thomas was exhausted. No matter how hard he worked, his farm barely survived. Bills kept growing. Debt increased every season. And while he worked 15 hours a day, his neighbor Richard worked only 6 hours daily and somehow earned twice as much. This frustrated Thomas deeply. How is this possible, he wondered every night. Then came the drought. Rain stopped falling for weeks. The entire valley suffered. Farmers struggled to save their crops, but Thomas pushed himself harder than ever before. He woke at 3 a.m. He carried bucket after bucket from a distant well. 40 trips, 50 trips. His body begged him to stop, but Thomas repeated the same words. Hard work never fails. One burning afternoon, while carrying another heavy bucket, his vision suddenly blurred. His legs collapsed beneath him. The bucket fell from his hands. Water disappeared into the dry earth. Thomas dropped to his knees, gasping for air. His heart pounded violently. He couldn't breathe. Sarah found him lying in the dirt between dying crops. The doctor later said, "If you continue like this, you may not survive another season." For the first time in his life, Thomas felt defeated. That night he stared silently at the ceiling while Sarah sat beside him. Finally he whispered, "I worked harder than everyone. So why am I failing?" Sarah gently held his hand. "Maybe," she said softly, "hard work alone isn't enough." Those words changed everything. A few days later, Thomas swallowed his pride and visited Richard's farm. Richard welcomed him warmly. Together they walked across green, healthy fields filled with thriving crops. Thomas looked around in disbelief. "How do you do this?" he asked quietly. "I work twice your hours, but you achieve twice my results." Richard smiled and took Thomas to his tool shed. Inside were two axes. One was old and dull, the other sharp and polished. Richard handed Thomas the dull axe. "Swing at that log," he said. Thomas swung again and again. The axe barely cut the wood. Then Richard picked up the sharp axe. One swing, two swings, three swings. The log split cleanly in half. Richard looked directly into Thomas's eyes. "You've been swinging a dull axe your entire life." Thomas stood silently. Richard continued, "A lot of people believe success comes from endless effort, but effort without strategy only creates exhaustion." Then Richard explained 3 lessons that changed Thomas forever. First lesson, systems beat struggle. "I don't carry water buckets," Richard explained. "I built an irrigation system." While Thomas spent 6 exhausting hours carrying water, Richard's system completed the same work automatically. Second lesson, focus creates excellence. "You grow 5 crops," Richard said. "You divide your attention everywhere. I grow only 2 crops, the ones that work best here." Richard mastered fewer things instead of struggling with many. Third lesson, rest is part of success. "You think resting is weakness," Richard said, "but exhausted people make poor decisions. A clear mind sees opportunities." Thomas finally understood something painful. He wasn't failing because he lacked effort. He was failing because effort was the only thing he understood. That evening, Thomas returned home with hope for the first time in years. The next morning, instead of working endlessly, he sat down with a notebook. He planned, he researched, he studied smarter farming methods. He invested in irrigation. He reduced unnecessary work. Slowly, everything changed. His working hours became shorter, but his results became bigger. He spent evenings with Sarah again. He laughed more. He slept peacefully. For the first time in years, Thomas felt alive. Months later, harvest season arrived, and something incredible happened. Thomas produced 40% more crops than ever before, not because he worked harder, but because he finally learned to work smarter. One evening, Richard visited Thomas's farm and smiled proudly. "You sharpened your axe," he said. Thomas nodded. And at that moment, he realized the greatest truth of all. Success is not about destroying yourself with endless labor. It's about using wisdom, strategy, focus, and energy wisely. Because hard work matters, but smart work changes lives. And sometimes, the strongest people are not the ones who never rest. They are the ones wise enough to stop, think, and sharpen the axe.